Good morning, and thank you for being here today. And I would really like to say a huge thank you to the conference organizers for having me here, because this is an opportunity I have not had prior to be able to come to Budapest. And it is, wow, you guys have an absolutely beautiful city. It was amazing driving in from the airport last night. I was like, wow, this is absolutely stunning. So it's really amazing in that regard to be able to travel the world and see sort of things like this. My talk today is called Sharks Patrol These Waters, and the whole idea here is talking about sharks in a way that we don't historically deal with. And I will align that with hackers. Because typically people in the past would say that sharks were a threat. These were the things you had to worry about. But nobody ever seems to be concerned about the ocean around them. So, who am I? Before I get too far down the road, you can find me on Twitter. I've been told that I should put that at the beginning of every talk, because I always put it at the end and nobody ever seems to catch that. So, I have been doing security in one form or another now for the better part of 25 plus years. I even started into these sort of things way before that, and along the way I have learned all sorts of lessons. And one of the things that I like to say pretty much in every talk I've ever been in is something that one of my mentors told me early on in my career. Write everything down. So as I've gone through my career, all the mistakes I've made, all the errors, the missteps, I have written them down. And the reason for this is because you learn from these mistakes. You learn from these, and you're able to take these messages forward and share them with others in the hopes that they don't make the same mistakes as well. So along the lines, I've done everything from being a firewall admin to being a CISO for a power company, and I have lots of scar tissue to show for it. So I apologize for my accent. I am Canadian, but don't hold that against me. And I find it's necessary these days to actually say that, because far too often people say, oh, you're an American. To the point where I was actually at a hotel in New Delhi about a couple years ago, and this well-dressed woman walked up to me in the lobby and said, excuse me, are you an American? I said, no, actually, I'm from Canada. She said, oh, good. That was a little bit disturbing, so much so that I actually had a maple leaf worked into my tattoo here, because I figured the patch on the backpack was far too much of an American thing. Nothing against the Americans, just, current state of affairs being what they are. So along the lines, I have worked in all sorts of organizations, and this is just a sampling of the places that I've either worked for, with, or on projects. And it has been really a great experience in a lot of cases. Currently, right now, I'm part of the Duo security team at Cisco Systems, and I get to travel the world having conversations about security and not having to worry about people's red staplers, not having to worry about people, arguing over who stole whose lunch out of the refrigerator. It's kind of nice. I don't miss managing large teams, I have to be honest. Because there were times at some of those organizations where your entire soul would be ripped from your body and thrown out of a window. And that's one of those things. As security practitioners, we are there because we have an innate curiosity. We have this wonderful ability to tear things apart. Not because we're evil, because we want to know how they work. We want to be able to tear these things apart to learn. And when we find these things and we learn from these mistakes that we or others have made, we can share those so that we can learn from them as well. Always got to work in the coffee breaks. So whether you're an attacker or a defender, we are all fundamentally defenders. As we go through our careers, if we're a pen tester, if we're in compliance, if we are in architecture, we are all there primarily for the same goal. We are there to defend our enterprise, whatever that happens to be. Corporation, higher education, government, whatever it happens to be, that is our shared function across the board. But too often we tend to get wrapped around issues that just don't matter. We'll get wrapped around things like, oh, it's on the dark web, or it's the deep dark web, or the one I like to coin as the Vanta web, because apparently that's the blackest of the black colors. And these are the kind of things that we spend far too much time on. My favorite was a few years back, this is quite a few years back now, there was a vulnerability that was issued for a half-installed WordPress installation. It wasn't fully installed, a partially installed WordPress installation. It was rated as high. I had to peel a CIO off the ceiling and explaining to him why it wasn't a problem. One, we didn't have WordPress in that particular environment. 2, we didn't have WordPress. Anyway, you get the idea. But this is just it. Far too often, because of the media churn, we tend to lose focus. And I've been perfectly guilty of that. Throughout my career, I've actually had the opportunity to write for publications like Forbes and Dark Reading and Daily Swig and things like that. And earlier on, I did make mistakes where I would write about something that was sensationalistic, and in retrospect, it was not entirely correct. So I did go back and publish a correction, which unfortunately doesn't happen enough. I'm not going to name a certain publication that talked about something in hardware, but anyway. We got to stop trying to sell people on things that really aren't going to be the issue. We need to look at things that are tackling fundamental security issues. And I just realized there's an upper deck. Hello. We have to look at doing the core fundamentals: patching, logging, network zone segmentation, user management. All of these are elements that we have known about for 25 plus years. And yet, we keep finding out about data breaches or errors or things that have happened that have led to vulnerabilities, led to compromises, led to issues where you just point at them and go, that didn't need to happen. So, back in 1983, I was fortunate enough to have a science teacher who had a computer in his class who let my classmate and I use it. And he taught us BASIC, and he did things like that, and we were very, very fortunate for that opportunity. He offered it to everyone in the class, but we were the only 2 that took him up on it. Within about a week of messing around on the computer, we figured out how to duplicate video games and sell them to kids in school. Made a tidy little profit on the side, but that's where my innate curiosity is, like, how can we go through and cause trouble? Because it was interesting. And I didn't like to break things because I felt it was necessary to be evil. I did it because I had that curiosity. And I was very fortunate that, a few months later, my father brought this thing home from work. You've never seen a kid so happy to use VisiCalc in all of your life. Judging by the giggles, a few people know what that is. This thing occupied my every waking moment to the point where my mother had to drag me off it by my ear because I wasn't paying attention to schoolwork or anything else. This was something that I focused on all the time. And it was just an undiscovered country to me. And as I went through and I looked at all these different things and I learned all these different things, and I went along and I kept asking my parents, I said, can I get magazines? Can I get documents? Can I get books? Because we didn't have any internet connection at the time. It just wasn't a thing back then. And I kept asking, and eventually I was able to find the information I needed. Eventually I was able to learn. And as we've gone through time, we've found things where mistakes were made, and we were able to look at stuff like this. This is one of my favorites here. Because going back to when I used to duplicate video games and sell them to kids in school, at one point in time, Sony put out these CDs with copy protection. And the whole idea was that you wouldn't duplicate their material and sell it, not to say anything about the fact that sharing music leads to greater sales. Anyway, this was able to be defeated with one of these. With just running around the outside edge of the CD, you were able to defeat this. And sharing stories like this was part of my raison d'etre back in 1997 when I started liquidmatrix.org. And this is a site that's still standing today for whatever reason. There's about 10 of us that work on it, and we have 0 advertising, so it's completely neutral. The whole idea here was to share stories, to embrace hacker culture, to make people understand what these security issues were of the day. Because I remember I was working at a financial institution back in 1998, and I was sharing these various stories, and people said, where do you keep finding these? And I literally had turned myself into an aggregator, so I started dumping them all here. Oddly enough, the script actually still works on the old version of the site, which if you know where to look, you can find it. So I grew up in an era where kids were meant to be seen, not heard. This was a bit of an aggravation as a child because I had a lot to say, but I wasn't allowed to say it. And over time, it really sort of built up to the point where now they just can't shut me up. So I really have turned that suppression into a career. And I've been able to take it further by founding stuff like BSIDES Toronto and working on various other conferences like BSIDES Las Vegas, Sector Toronto, and sorts of things around the world. The rationale here is, again, being able to share stories, be able to have things like an event like this where you get together and learn. Because unfortunately, hackers tends to be a term that is looked at with negativity in many circles. This doesn't need to be this way. We need to manage that narrative. As a collective, we have to stop them from using hackers as a derogatory term. We have to look at it and say, no, those are the attackers that broke into your site, not the hackers. I know that may sound trivial, but the attackers, by saying that, you are showing criminal intent. If you have an innate curiosity about security, if you are in this room, by virtue of that, you are a hacker. And we have to take that term back in many ways. Because we have to learn how to manage the panic that we find in the C-suite. And I've worked in enough organizations to know that this is a real and present danger. When you have C-level executives that are flying somewhere and they pull out an airline magazine and read some story about some security issue that has been dead for over a year, you are spending all sorts of time and effort trying to pull them off the ceiling to explain to them why that's not an issue. When in reality, as security practitioners, we should be taking the time to educate them in advance, to make sure they understand what the fundamental security issues are. And we have to look at things like the core fundamentals. We have to drag it back to looking at those building blocks that we tend to get lost on. We look at the sharks, we don't look at the ocean. How many people a year drown in oceans? Lakes, rivers. How many people are eaten by sharks? Numbers skew rather significantly. And we have to realize that as hackers, not everybody likes us. It's amazing. Every time I do this search, I get a different result, and it gets darker and darker as I go along, so I just took that one screenshot and moved on. Because the world sees us like this. The horrible, horrible stock image of a hacker in a hoodie with thick leather gloves tapping away on a keyboard. All right, anybody in this room ever use thick leather gloves to type on a keyboard? Exactly. To be fair, I did it once, but it was 3 a.m. in a data center and I was freezing. But that's another story entirely. We need to make sure that the world understands that these are hackers. Could be anybody. Look at this room. Indistinguishable. I don't see a single black hoodie over somebody's head right now. Oh, there goes one. Because people have this negative bent towards us, and we need to embrace ourselves as well as the wider audience so they understand who we are. They have to understand why we are here. What is our function? Because we are part of the ecosystem. Back in 2006, I was fortunate/unfortunate enough to get on the front cover of a magazine. God, I was pudgy back then. My father's reaction, my father was then CFO for a financial company that will remain nameless. He looked at it and he said, I would have fired you. Because in his mind, security should never be seen, shouldn't be heard. His whole thing was security should be seamless. I agree to a point. We have to be able to have open and frank discussions about what security means. And if we don't have these conversations, we don't communicate in an effective manner to the wider audience, we end up seeing the world like this. We don't need to have this negative bent towards the world, but on the same token, we have to stop doing things like searching on Shodan going, look at this idiot over here, look what they did on their website. Because unfortunately, we do this far too often. And that takes away from our collective credibility. We have to make sure that we are enabling folks, enabling companies, governments, organizations to better secure themselves rather than to ridicule them. We have to own this. Don't get me wrong, Shodan's a wonderful tool, but it has to be used in the right way. Otherwise, we have to deal with the law of unintended consequences. We go through our careers, and if we ridicule users, if we ridicule organizations, eventually they're going to stop talking to us altogether. Have you ever seen a dog chasing a car down a road? When it's just determined to catch that bumper, and it's going, finally, one day, it caught that car. It sunk its teeth into the bumper. And then it went, oh shit, now what? And that's just it. We as security are at that point in our evolution. We look at the medical field, jurisprudence, all of these different these different verticals. They have been doing their craft for hundreds of years. If I'm being generous, we've been doing this for about 25, 30 years. We have got a lot of maturing to do collectively, and now that we have caught the bumper on the car, now that the C-suite is paying attention to us, we need to be the adults in the room. We need to effectively communicate. Otherwise, things like this are going to continue to happen. When WannaCry happened, this was using a vulnerability that was known for a better part of over a decade. This was something that we could have collectively pushed to get fixed, and yet we didn't. Because the world sees us very much in a different fashion. They think we're making a lot of noise, and they're like, we have to talk in terms of risk. We have to talk in terms that they're going to understand so that they will take us seriously. At the core of it, we know who we are. We are the dog on the keyboard. But the thing is, we have a different persona online than we really do in reality. Data breaches are going to keep happening. Back in 2012, I started tracking data breaches on my own site, and then back then, 6 million records was considered a massive data breach. Today, wouldn't even get a front page mention. Now we are talking in orders of magnitude of billions of records. Billions of records. How many people in here are familiar with Amazon's AWS S3 buckets? Show of hands. Nice, excellent. So, if you are creating an S3 bucket, and for those of you who may not be aware, an S3 bucket is a data repository you can spin up with a credit card and a web browser, and you can put all sorts of manner of data in there. When you create one, this is part of the screen you see. I actually went through and did screenshots because at one point on Twitter, there was this huge conversation about S3 buckets, and people are saying, oh, Amazon's to be held accountable for this. And it's like, no. See right there? It says, do not grant public read access. Right there. Do not. By default, they do not allow public access. I'll say that again. By default, they do not allow public access. Unfortunately, these buckets, when they are spun up, invariably, it is done by people who are not in a security role. So is it their fault? No. It's our fault because we have not communicated why this is a problem. We need to do a far better job of making sure that we get this message across. Because if we don't get this message across, the narrative takes on a life of its own. And we get garbage like this, where trolls have gone from being a minor annoyance to being an institutionalized thing. You have entire farms of trolls that are doing their function to change people's versions of reality. This is unfortunately painting us collectively in a negative light because the greater public lumps us all into the same bucket. And that's the problem, is that perception tends to be 9/10 of reality. And the perception being is that somehow hackers are this magical beast that traipses through the forest of Narnia, and we can just magically touch a computer and we're in. Unfortunately, part of that is due to shows like Mr. Robot and Scorpion. One of those shows is really good. One of those shows is a raging nightmare. But that's just it. We need to manage those perceptions. So with an organization, if they hire somebody to do web security, do they just hire a baker or somebody who actually knows what they're doing? Not to say that a baker can't do security, but in all likelihood, if their thing is baguettes, you're really not going to get too far. Would you use a surgeon to lock down your voter database? No. Would you expect a philosopher to run your security practice when all they've ever done is protect their own version of events, as opposed to the wider good? We want to make sure that we are putting the right people in the right positions. All of those three examples could perfectly be security people if they were trained up, but you wouldn't hire them straight out of their jobs into a new role and say, you're in charge now. In the United States, the White House, they just pointed out that they have lost 12 security practitioners in the last couple months. 12 of them. They have given up their entire security practice, and it's really insane because bad things are going to happen. Back in 2016, there was this article that came out about a hacker who came forward and said he helped manipulate the results of an election in Mexico. At the time, everybody were like, that never happens. Hello. Jump forward to the future. Sometimes the old ways work. In Canada, we still use paper ballots. Granted, we do have scanning machines to count the ballots, but we have that audit trail that's available to us. The Americans have machines with no audit trail in many cases. If you've been to DEF CON, they have an entire village dedicated to looking at these machines and tearing them apart. If you ever get a chance to see that, I highly recommend it. And if we look at these things in a sane light, we understand that hackers have a core function. We are there to poke things in the eye in a constructive fashion. Much like sharks, if you remove us from the ecosystem, bad things are going to happen. Sharks serve a real purpose, very much as hackers do. We tend to worry too much about threats. We tend to get wrapped around the axle about things that really aren't a problem. Like a 0-day in an AIX box from X number of years ago, and when you're running an entire Windows shop or whatever it happens to be, you have to really start managing what those expectations are and communicating that effectively to senior management. And then when I say effectively, we have to get to end a job, because otherwise we end up in what we call analysis paralysis. At one point, I was working at a power company. I don't know how he got a boat and still got stuck there, but that's another thing. I was working at a power company years ago, and I found, in conjunction with my team, to be honest, we found a vulnerability that would have really caused some significant damage if it was exposed to the internet. And we went to him, we said, look, we need to get this fixed. And the CIO said, you have 5 minutes, convince me. And I was like, uh-oh. Because he meant convince him in terms he understood. Luckily, in 2.5 minutes, I was able to convince him as to the risk, the financial penalties that would be incurred, the damage that could be done from a reputational perspective, without running around with my hair on fire. It worked. We were able to get the things that we needed in order to remedy the situation. But had I not approached it in that manner, he would have thrown me out of his office. Hackers go through and we look for these vulnerabilities and we look for these issues to remove them from the food chain, much in the same way as sharks keep food stocks down to a manageable level. Because if you have too much of a food stock, eventually they end up overpopulating, getting sick, dying, causing all sorts of decay. And that's not good. And if you remove hackers from the stage, then we're going to have a greater problem in that there's going to be so many vulnerabilities that only the bad guys, only the attackers are going to have the ability to get in. There have been some countries in the world that have legislated against hackers, and this does concern me. Now, sharks typically don't get sick. Something about them that allows them to be resilient, and they've been roughly the same design for eons. Well, not that long, but a very, very long time. So they have all sorts of different properties that allow them benefits that we would not have otherwise appreciated. As hackers, we think differently. We don't look at a ABC approach. We have not a linear, we definitely have a lateral way of thinking. And this is a good thing. So we need to use those abilities to help better educate, to build better systems. Sharks keep the carbon footprint of the world in motion. As fish die off, they are able to eat away the dead fish so that they do not rot and produce more carbon. They actually have a serious positive function. We as we as hackers go through and we find these low-hanging fruit. We find these systems and we go into them and we find the issues and help them remediate that so that we don't have all of this detritus that leads to an unsafe internet. We need to inspire better design. At one point in my career, I was working at this one organization where we had 2 physical locations, and we were using BGP to manage the route you took based on where you were in the world to which system you would go to. On the surface, that sounds like a good idea. But these two buildings were less than 20 kilometers apart. So it was pretty much a trivial exercise to do this. So we changed it, and we said, well, what if it was under attack? What if you were trying to knock these systems down? So we built one side that was a primary and another side that was a hot standby. And they would fail over automatically depending on what happened. You could take systems offline and it would fail over automatically using things like VRRP and things to that effect, because we approached it as if it was under attack. We said, how can we design this system so that it is resilient? Sharks inspire smart design, because you look at it built into cars, motorcycles, airplanes, all sorts of things, where people are learning from them, even swimmers. Because of the nature of their scales, they are able to go faster. That has inspired new suit designs for Olympic swimmers so that they can go faster through the water as well. Design is a key element. You want to democratize security. How many people in here have their parents using PGP? Now, don't get me wrong, I like PGP, but it is not a user-friendly experience. If we want people outside of this room to use security, we have to give them the tools that they can use. A hammer can build a house, or it can bludgeon you about the head and neck. It's how you use it. But if you give them a tool that is very clear, like a spoon, full credit to my boss, Wendy Nather, it's kind of hard to mess up using a spoon. Design is a key piece of the puzzle, and we need to democratize security. And when I say that, the whole purpose is to make it more accessible. Because if we don't do that, then more and more people are going to diverge away from that, and they're going to go back to sticking their passwords on sticky notes on the side of a screen. And we get rid of that with things like WebAuthn. This is an open standard that was ratified in the last year by W3C. I'll say that again, an open standard. I gave this talk, a version of this, well, not this talk, but I talked about WebAuthn in Singapore at one point, and they told me I was trying to pitch a product. And I was like, well, no. This is very much an open standard, so that's why I hammer away on that. This is a way to do access to systems without having a static username and password. This is the kind of thing that we can use to improve security across the board. And together we have safety in numbers. We are able to get the message across, in an effective way. Now, back in 2003, I was working for a power company in Ontario when we had a massive blackout. This took out all of North America. I was at a tennis match, and I was watching it, and then the lights went out in the stadium, and I went, okay, that's crazy. This was a vendor event, of course. And I'm sitting there going, okay, that's different. And it was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so I figured it was okay. And the power would come back shortly. It didn't. About 3 minutes later, my phone rang. My boss said, you got to get in here. And I said, what's up? He goes, power out. And I said, yeah, I can see that. How bad? He goes, bad. I said, Toronto? No. Ontario? Keep going. Damn, I'll be right there. So what should have been a 20-minute drive back to the office ended up being 2 hours because every light in the city was out. Every street light was out. Thankfully, my fellow citizens in Toronto were good enough to manage traffic, but this wasn't their forte, but they were out there trying. Collectively, we pulled together to make things better. As hackers, we can do the same. Now, in my career, I have had the ability to go through and do a lot of security research before I had kids, back when I had free time. And the last time I did any sort of research was 2008, and I found all sorts of vulnerabilities. And it was a trivial exercise for me to do because this wasn't my forte of doing, bona fide security research. I didn't have any support mechanisms in place. I just happened to have a lab and all the tools at my disposal, so I just started poking away at them. And I was actually amazed at what I found. And in some cases, when I communicated these things to various organizations, WebSense was fantastic. They patched the thing that I found and pushed out the patch to their customers in under 2 hours. That was amazing. And then we look at the other ones here. There are so many of these that they were fun to work with. The Cisco folks, back before I worked for Cisco, I found a vulnerability in one of their tools, sent it to them, they've patched it, sent me the fix. Unfortunately, in the fix, there was another problem, and they fixed that right away. It was all done in a day. It was amazing. One company who's not on that list wasn't so forthcoming. They threatened me. They said, "We will sue you into oblivion." They told me they knew people. This is a massive international corporation. This was at a time where I did not have the resources or the capacity to fight back. One of these days I might write about it. But at this point in my career, I will not. These are the sort of things where I had no support mechanisms in place. But there are things like that now where we're talking about bug bounties. Bug bounties, love them or hate them, this is not something I ever imagined would exist back in 2008. And this is just an example of hackers pulling together to help build a better future. And we do have that within our capacity to do. This was an idea that I never thought would come to fruition. Ever. And yet, people will pitch ideas that are just seem abjectly terrible, and then 6 or 7 movies later, they're still making these things. If you have an idea, bring it forward. Share it with your community. You have a community here. You have communities around the world. You have organizations you can get involved with to give your ability, your voice to part of the collective so that we can make a better future for ourselves. So where do we go from here? We need to manage the narrative. We need to mature as a vertical, as security practitioners, so that the C-suite doesn't fear us, so that the public at large see us as a benefit. We are the dog that caught the bumper. We really do have to figure out what to do with it now. Organizations have to understand the benefit that hackers bring to the table. Not these scary, mysterious characters that can touch a monitor and poof, we're in, because it doesn't work that way. I've done enough pen tests to know it does not work that way. As we go through this, both sides of the fence need to come together to have these conversations to understand the benefit. Much like sharks, we have to understand they aren't the threat. The ocean is a threat. We have to look at things in their proper perspective. As hackers, we need to embrace the organizations so that they understand what we expect of them. We have to not ridicule them. As hackers, we have to look within ourselves and figure out how we can come together to do what we do in a way that is going to be accepted on a wider plane. We can do this. We can move forward. We can get back to the core fundamentals. We need to embrace the hackers. Thank you very much for your time today. Close it. And I don't know if I'm doing questions, but I got a couple minutes. If anybody has any? No? Oh, yes.
How was your reaction when the unnamed company tried to sue you? What did you think about it in the first time?
So the question was, what was my reaction when the company threatened to sue me? It was not a good conversation. I was absolutely beside myself, and I did lose sleep over it. And it was really an upsetting endeavor. And I really wish I did have the benefit of having bug bounty programs, EFF, anything like that, that is available today. So there are a lot of support mechanisms that are available today that weren't around at that time. Cheers. We got a mic up here if there's anybody else, I think. All right, the mic's dead. Any other questions? I can repeat them back. No? All right, well, enjoy the conference.